There was a really interesting question about that. Of that 2.8%, how much of that is investment locally versus globally? That figure was a global figure. It referred to global investments in the energy system. A lot of it, I hope my slides will be made available to people, and there was a breakdown, which I'm sure you didn't all absorb, in the different colours of the bar, was what we invested in coal plants versus what we invested in energy efficiency, for example. And there was a big shift, obviously enough, in the investment we make in fossil fuel supply to the investment we make in energy efficiency in that figure. So a lot of that shift is a shift of investment from large-scale central generation to local investment in more efficient use of energy and generation of energy, like the Osney Hydro Scheme, for example. So that's an example of how it's a diversion of investment from one scale to another, and that's a big feature of that shift. In answer to that question of how much of that investment is local, much more of it is local in the 1.5 future than it is in the fossil fueled future, where the investment in energy remains very highly centralised and dominated by a few large generators, like the old Didcot power station that we all remember and love. I should pass on to other panel members to comment on some of these other questions as well, perhaps particularly the intergenerational ones.
Is this working? Yeah, okay. There were two questions there that I thought I might be able to answer some bits for. In terms of the intergenerational responsibility question, I think one of the main things is being able to join our rally and cause, as in what young people are campaigning against aren't just the habits of the older generation, but we are trying to tackle the whole establishment, which is quite often dominated by a lot of politics and governmental issues, and often it's quite hard for us as individuals to tackle the really large businesses which rely on fossil fuels on our own. And so with that, we really do need the older population to join us in that. I mean, there's things like, holding the government to account and bearing that in mind when you're making political decisions is something that we all should strive towards. But there's also things like getting clued up about where your money is invested, where pensions are invested, because often we don't realise that we are supporting the fossil fuel industry. So looking at your bank is a really interesting one, because if we change our demand, then we can sort of put pressure to show that we want the supply to change. And that's something that young people can't do without adults, because the adults are the people who have mainly got that investment. So that's the thing I'd say about that.
Yeah, just quickly, just going back to Myles' point on spreading the message that climate change is fixable. I think right now it's more important to see that there is a solution in place and it can be achieved. And I think what caused the climate silence, and while we're here today declaring the climate emergency, is that we all got a little bit overwhelmed by the catastrophe that was climate change. And so articles described how we were doomed and there was something that we were going to do, or the polar bears were going to go into extinction. That never gave us a solution. What were we going to do after that, reading that article? Were we just going to shut our bedroom door and hide under the duvet cover? So having that fix, having that solution gives people that kind of sense of empowerment that actually, yes, being here at this assembly is really important actually, because we can make those targets, so it's very important to have that. Also just wanted to comment on as well about actions we can take as individuals, because I had an interesting conversation at a table over there about, we talk about the kind of greater scale and acting as a society rather than acting as an individual. And I would put caution to actually talking about the individual responsibility while tackling climate change or meeting its impacts, because it can very easily lead to narratives associated with blame and shame. And we've seen that, and I've had personal experience of that as well, where I tell a close friend that I'm a vegetarian, and they'd be like, "Oh, I only eat meat once a week, and I don't want to talk about this." And you would get that sense of kind of defensiveness that they don't want to engage in that conversation with me anymore. But I was just sharing a lifestyle choice that I had made myself. So I think it's important for us to kind of act as individuals, act the way you want to see the world, make those lifestyle choices that you know will benefit the world and will benefit future generations. But I think see us as a society, as a community, working together with diverse ideas, diverse cultures, worldviews, political leanings, that when we all act together and see ourselves in that story, we can all do something really impactful for the world.
There are a few more questions for Myles later, if you want to put a bit more time.
I just want to pick up, it was the sub-question from that last one you were talking about, which I thought was a really interesting question. Do we have to give up something? So collectively, it's really simple. We have to give up dumping CO2 into the atmosphere. But if you think about it, that wasn't something we particularly wanted to do in the first place. People want energy, light, prosperity, generally, but we never particularly wanted to use the atmosphere as a landfill. So we just have to work out how to do whatever it is we want to do, whatever it is we're prepared to pay to do, without dumping CO2 into the atmosphere. The whole problem is really quite that simple. By the way, just to be completely clear about this, what we need to absolutely stop doing is dumping fossil CO2 into the atmosphere. Obviously, every time you breathe, you put a little bit of CO2 into the atmosphere, but that CO2 has been taken out of the atmosphere by the cow you ate, or in your case, the cabbage you ate yesterday. I mean, anyway, the point is that my point is that it's dumping fossil CO2s, carbon which has been underground for hundreds of millions of years, into the atmosphere at a rate millions of times faster than the rate at which it was taken out naturally. Originally, this carbon was once in the atmosphere, but it was fossilized an awful long time ago. It's that dumping of fossil CO2 into the atmosphere that's what we need to stop doing. But that's not, and it's really, but people break that down. Oh, then I won't be able to do X, I won't be able to do Y, I won't be able to do Z, because all of these activities involve putting CO2 into the atmosphere. In every case, there's another way of doing that thing that does not involve a net dumping of CO2 into the atmosphere. And I stress net at the end there, because there may well be things, even in 50 years' time, that we find it makes sense to burn fossil fuels to do, but we have to then recapture that CO2 from the atmosphere. Again, this is perfectly possible, and get rid of it in some way that it doesn't get left lying around in the atmosphere causing climate change. So I don't think, my personal, I need to be a little bit careful here, my personal view is that I think it's unlikely we will stop using fossil fuels entirely this century. It's very dangerous to make strong predictions about technological trends, because people come up with new things all the time, but it's certainly perfectly possible that we'll still be using fossil fuels in a big way at the end of this century, not in as big a way as we are now, but you know, at a significant level. But it is also possible that even in that future, we will have solved climate change. We will have stopped it, because we will be recapturing the carbon dioxide generated by those fossil fuels and getting rid of it in some way other than dumping it into the atmosphere. After all, it came from underground, it can be put back there. But you know, so that's the. So to circle back to the question, do we have to give up anything? Dealing with the waste properly from our use of fossil fuels, i.e. not just dumping it into the atmosphere, but disposing of it safely, will make fossil fuels more expensive. And therefore, undoubtedly, some of the uses we put them to at the moment, we may not want to use them for anymore, because it doesn't make sense to use a very expensive fuel to do something which we could use a much cheaper alternative for. That's not really giving anything up, that's just doing the sensible thing and using the cheaper alternative.
Great. I think that pretty much covers everything broadly anyway, the questions that were asked by the tables. One more here, we have 1 minute.
We had a question on greener buildings, but you are getting Nick Eyre here later on, so that will definitely be checked.
We have one for
Go on.
that.
Go on.
That's helpful.
Okay, one last question, go on.
Okay, how do young people stay on message when they become economically active?
Well, I've got a couple of thoughts on that. One, that it's not like there's going to be a sudden date at which point suddenly all the people who are young and didn't have money suddenly are workers and have money and will have to make a lifestyle change. I think that, every day, there are more people becoming more economically viable on their own. And I think to a certain extent, people are managing money earlier. There is quite a large culture, from my own experience, that there are people who are going out and getting jobs and starting to get into that. And in terms of sticking with those values, I think that young people are much more clued up than maybe previous generations of young people had been in that position, as in they know about these issues more, just because of the way how their information is spread, and it's the thing that they talk about, so they'll know more about that. And therefore I think that people will be making decisions with that in mind, especially to do with things like banks and where money is put, as opposed to sort of always where it's used. I think that there is a significant shift towards sort of greener options, such as like cooperative bank and stuff like that. But it's not just an individual issue, and it's a problem that when my generation sort of grows up, will be trying to push for more sort of institutional change, more change with the way things are governed and how companies run. And so I think that increase in people who are demanding less investment in fossil fuels will create larger change, even if people may not see it as much on an individual sense.
Great. We're going to call it a day there. We're going to discuss this as we go. First of all, before we do anything else, I just want to say thank you to the expert panel. So thank you very much.